Try to keep it all within 15, 90 minutes.
Yeah, and the max, 60 to 90. Yep. You can start recording. I started recording.
Hi, good evening, everybody. We thank you for joining us at our SDP in conversation this evening. Together with me, we have Professor Paul Tambyah and Wendy Low from PSP joining us. Now, maybe Professor Paul would like to introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, hi. As most of you know, I'm an infectious disease physician, but I'm also chairman of the Singapore Democratic Party. And the party has put out a number of policy papers over the years dealing with many aspects that are covered in the budget, including healthcare, education, population, and the economy. Now let's hear from Wendy. Thank you very much for joining us from PSP. Wendy is the head of the PSP Women's Wing.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Paul Tambyah, as also an SDP for inviting us over for this forum. I think one of the most immediate response we receive from the ground is that there's a lot of anticipation of joint collaborations with our parties. So I think we are looking forward to more of such conversations. For myself, I'm actually an intellectual property lawyer. So I've just shared with Alfred and Dr. Paul as well that where I think I can value add to tonight's conversation is really to try and give some perspective of where I think the budget can be enhanced in terms of Singapore's long-term growth and innovation. With PSP, I was an ex-candidate with the team in Tanjung Pagar. And after the last general election in 2020, I was also tasked to set up our very first women's wing. And since our inauguration in January last year, I think we've looked into a number of conversations as well, both within the party as well as with external members, social media personalities, as to what is the new storyboard that we actually want to create for the Singaporean women. And not only Singaporean women, but men who are active partners, family household members, brothers, fathers, and the kind of roles that they want to play in Singapore's growth. And a lot of our agenda is actually tied to the inclusivity that goes beyond just gender equality. And we've actually named our agenda the Inclusivity Agenda, which we hope more Singaporeans will come to be aware of. But I think one part of that conversation, which we saw a lot of promise, was PM Lee's announcement last year that in the lead up to this inclusivity move by Singaporeans in general, we are looking to establish a bill for anti-discrimination measures, which right now is actually governed by the Tripartite Alliance. So I think there's a lot of exciting conversations that we can try and move in this direction, and I'm actually looking forward to that.
Thanks. Thank you, Wendy. I'm Alfred Tan. I'm a businessman with background in banking and finance, industry and commerce. I've run and managed businesses in both domestically and in the region. I'm a member of the Singapore Democratic Party, a candidate for the Holland Bukit Timah GRC in the last general election. Well, as I said, it's great that we have PSP together with us in this conversation. And tonight's conversation will be centering around the budget that has just been discussed in Parliament in this last 2 weeks. I guess to start us off, we'll talk about what are aspects of the 22 budget that we can think of that we like or we can agree upon. Well, maybe Professor Paul can start us off.
Well, to start on a positive note, I think, again, to be fair, I agree that with the budget's move to raise the income tax on incomes above $1 million, they brought it to 24%, which is still not where it was in the 1970s, in the best years of Singapore's economy. But it's at least a step in the right direction. The higher ARF for luxury cars, maybe you won't see too many of these Ferraris giving trouble in the future if the ARF is going to go up as promised. There are some moves towards the carbon taxes, but again, I'm not so sure how effective carbon taxes are in moving towards a zero emissions strategy. And unfortunately, to be honest, that's about all I think that I found positive in the budget.
Okay. And how about Wendy? What's your opinion?
So I think there is a recognition of the need to develop the SME, which is an important sector. And there appears to be two initiatives that are geared towards the direction, right? So there's the Singapore Global Enterprises Initiative, which is one directed towards overseas investment, and another one on the talent mentorship under the Singapore Global Executive Program. So I think the signaling is right in terms of growing the SME sector, which provides, I think, about 60% of the local employment. But if you read into the finer details of such schemes, it seems to be supporting the larger size SMEs in Singapore. So while I think it's a signaling in the right direction, I think there needs to be a lot more to be done in nurturing the local, smaller sized SMEs who can probably benefit from a lot more support.
Right.
I think the other aspect which is welcomed is probably the increasing of the workforce income supplement for workers aged 30 to 34. So that's a newer and younger income group profile. But then with the new criteria of having a minimum of monthly of $500 per month income, I think that can be limiting, especially for workers with disabilities or caught up in chronic long-term care, say of elderly parents or very young children at home. And the requirement to maintain that $500 per month criteria might actually be very, very limiting. So while there are some positive, again, movements in some of these policies, I think we should be looking at reducing criteria to make such wage income supplements to be easier for Singaporeans who need them to claim, as opposed to adding something new, but also taking away by adding new criteria, which could literally make this more supportive. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Well, for myself, I'm heartened to see some initial and concrete action steps to transit the Singapore economy, nation to a greener one. I'm glad to hear the affirmation by our government for our net zero carbon emission target and affirming it to get it done by 2050. That's heartening to me. What the budget has stated is that we want to be quite upfront and early as far as the green financing area is concerned. Promises to have more electric vehicle charging points around Singapore. That will definitely help the conversion of internal combustion cars to EVs, as well as putting in place a carbon tax and credit system. How it will be done, how it will be executed is something that we will see. And I hope to see more initiatives ahead, especially our government, our civil service, our GLCs, with the critical mass as in terms of the number of buildings and programs that they have. Hopefully they can effect the change a lot quicker. So I hope that we can accelerate the building of this new green ecosystem, because with this, there will be more new jobs created, more business opportunities for both Singapore and for us in the region. And will that cost consumers more? I guess in the initial stage, there may be such concerns, and I really hope that the businesses as well as the government, upon better understanding, better technology, better understanding of the process of the green ecosystem and economy, the costs will come down over time as more efficiencies harnessed. The other thing that I was impressed or happy was that the government listened a little bit on our foreign workers policy. They did some adjustments. I think the building up of the local employment is important without preventing foreign expertise from contributing and complementing the Singaporean talent core. So it raised minimum qualifying salaries for the EPs and the S passes to protect the Singapore PMETs from this lower wage competitors from the region. The dependency ratio ceilings and levies for work permits as well as S passes has also been tweaked, and this will nudge our local businesses to seriously look at how to improve their business operating model so that we can depend a lot less on manual labor, switch a little bit more into technology, especially in the construction and process industries. So I hope this will definitely support and improve our workforce in Singapore as well as our local economy. But I also feel that there is a need to relate as well as build the Singaporean and the society as a whole. We just should not give out passes, assess our foreign workers coming in purely on just their qualification, but also on their ability to integrate into our society, to integrate into the work environment that they will be in the near future. Things like their language ability, are they able to, willing to adapt to the culture in Singapore? I think that is definitely a criteria we need to look at, and we as a whole of society should look at how to help integrate these migrants into the society so that they can better complement us in Singapore. Well, there's about 3.5 million Singapore citizens in Singapore, with about 500,000 of PRs. That makes a total of about 4 million residents, plus another 1.5 million of foreign workers and their dependents. What it means is that out of these 5.5 million people in Singapore, the number keep moving, every 3 person you see, one of them will be a non-Singaporean or non-PR. So it's important to help them integrate into their work environment, integrate into our economy, integrate into our society. I think that is something we can certainly look further into. Now, we talked about what...
Actually, I'm going to take you up on that. You know, like I said, SDP, as you know, has been supportive of people who are willing to contribute. I mean, most of us, our grandparents and our great-grandparents were immigrants in the first place. But I'm a bit skeptical of that raising the salary of the lowest paid EP and S-Pass holders is going to persuade employers to employ Singaporeans instead. Because the reality is inflation is pretty rampant. And you know, the dependency ratio, while it looks good on paper, again, I'm sure you've heard anecdotes of how people try and get around the dependency ratio. And so without putting in a mandate, you know, that if you raise the salary of an EP holder, you have to ensure that you have actually seriously gone around looking, not just put up a job ad for 2 weeks and hope that no one sees it, you know, that kind of thing. Because there are other factors that come into play. You know, Singaporeans who are competing with an S-Pass holder, they have their own families to look after. They have aged parents who may be sick, who need to see the doctor. So I think the whole ecosystem has to be made more fair. Because I think basically, and I said this at the PSP forum the other day, what young Singaporeans are looking for is not really a handout, but it's more for a level playing field.
Yes.
Whereas if you have an S-Pass holder who's willing to come in here, work, you know, long hours and just for 2 to 3 years and then go back, you know, it's not a fair comparison.
Sure.
And in fact, it's exploitation of the S-Pass holder because it may have an impact on their health, you know, doing excessive overtime just to make the most amount of money that they can. So it's not good, I think, all round.
Yeah.
So in theory, again, I agree with you that, you know, the concept or the principle of recognizing that we cannot just use foreign workers as a race to the bottom, or have people whose only talent is being willing to work for a lower salary. You know, that's not a good thing.
Sure.
But I'm not so sure that just raising the salaries of the foreign workers is going to solve that problem.
And the Minister for Manpower has claimed that they have this score system of which they would assess whether the company is indeed helping the Singapore core. Are they exploiting the local core? We'll see. We'll see how it.
Well, you know, that was actually copied from our SDP's talent program that we introduced in 2012, and I think PSP has something similar, right? In your approach to foreign talent or foreign workers.
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's quite heartening to say that some of our proposals, you know, for example, raised through Manwar and Hazel in Parliament has received some notice. And I think that reinforces the sentiments that we gathered from our ground during last campaign that Singaporeans do want more alternative voices to lend perspective on alternative solutions or proposals that can be good for the Parliament's consideration for the benefit of all Singaporeans. And I think that's what we've been collectively working towards. Yeah, I think for me, one of the greatest questions I have as a Singaporean looking at a budget has always been a slightly more structural one, which is, well, it's a good idea to be projecting forward in terms of spending for healthcare, spending for education. There isn't a very systemic sense of where this budget is going forward. And it doesn't have a very clear sense of what we can have been spending in terms of the past. So to put it very broadly, right, it's a sense of what was our past spending, what are some of the present resources we can really look into, and what are some of the future directions we should be looking forward in terms of allocation of budgets, you know, how this can actually realize a greater goal for fellow Singaporeans. And I think one of my greatest concern down the direction of future planning really is that I think when you talk about healthcare spending and educational spending, a lot of this probably takes time in projections, in understanding very clearly where Singapore might actually want to develop itself in terms of its educational plan. I think it was actually interesting that during the election period, there was one statistic which came up. I don't have the figures right now, but I think it's along the lines to say that Singapore actually had a need of about 60,000 Infocom jobs, but our graduates back then was only able to meet a small proportion of that, right? And so it's not just to say that, oh, I want to spend how many $1 billion more in education in 5 years down, but where exactly do we want to allocate such spending in terms of the actual sectors of growth for our graduates? You know, what kind of jobs specifically are we tailoring our graduates to working towards? Because there's no point in spending billions of dollars to have your graduates graduate with a good degree, but that good degree doesn't necessarily translate to the kind of jobs that they can look forward to having when they graduate from the tertiary education. And I think that's the kind of future planning that I was hoping that the budget would provide more perspectives of. And I think that's actually important, at least from maybe a lay Singaporean's understanding of the budget, because a lot of the facts and figures may be lost on the average Singaporeans, the younger Singaporeans. But I think if you can talk in a more realistic sense of what we are commonly working towards achieving, I think that can translate into a more realistic sense among Singaporeans to feel like whether this is a budget that we should all be embracing and supporting, or If not, it would actually take away a lot of the sense of trust that I think it's important for Singaporeans to have with the government. I mean, whichever the party happens to be ruling as of day. I mean, of course, now it's PAP, but over time, I think it's important that we do not erode that trust. And much as we're talking about numbers in terms of budgeting, it's also about a relationship that people have with the government, right? So your emotional account, the trust that you have with the government, there is a lot of trust that's been built up in the last decades in our growth, our very rapid growth as Singapore. But over time, I think as with the election results, you are seeing an erosion of that emotional deposit, that trust deposit. And I think, in a very broad sense, I think much as you can provide a lot of statistics and justification and the reasons why the budget could be worked out in a particular way, I think there's very strong sense amongst fellow Singaporeans that they are in the end contributing a lot more than what they could be gaining, whether it's through their children's jobs, their healthcare for their parents, the asset accumulation through their HDBs. So I think it's important to regain that sense of collective trust.
Sure. Okay. Noted. Well, what do you think? Any disagreement, points of disagreement in the budget 22 that you see from your perspective, Wendy?
So I mentioned some of the earlier points where I think there are some positive rings, but I think specifically I feel that in terms, well, I'm not sure if I was steering too early into the GST conversation. But looking at some of our, like I mentioned, the earlier structure that I was hoping to see more within the budget, I think one of the points that has been raised by Mawai is this spending or projected spending of 900 million over the next 5 years for SPH Media Trust. And there's some questions raised as well if the job support scheme in the past year have actually been supporting some of the companies which have been profitable. So I think to me, a budget needs to give a more proper accounting of where some of these budgets or some of these budget allocations can be better accounted for. And I think in that perspective, we have also had conversations before. I think Francis has mentioned the last discussion with Lam Keong as well, which is the current budget spending for the civil sectors. It does actually look at a projection that's been based on existing spending per year. So again, if we are relying on that kind of a spending structure, again, moving forward, there could be a lot of waste and allocation of resources that can be better managed so that when we relook at the budget, there can be a better sense of how some of the waste from the past can actually be better managed and cut down so that resources can be allocated for future spending.
Okay, understand.
Yeah.
Paul, what's your take?
Yeah, I think I agree with Wendy about this whole question of trust. And the idea that, in our parents' generation, there was a sense that everybody had a chance, that there was an equal chance to move forward. But now there's an increasing sense that the society has become more and more elitist. And I'm not just talking about schools and places where you can live or the 5 Cs or the clubs and things like that. But the entire tax structure seems to me extremely regressive. When you think about it, who pays the highest taxes in Singapore? It's actually the Myanmar domestic worker who's getting a salary of $450 and pays a levy of $300. That's a whopping 40% of her salary. And the domestic workers are the ones who do the most important jobs. They look after our elderly parents, they look after our children, and yet they are paying the highest taxes compared to, say, a billionaire who's inherited their wealth, lives in a rented good class bungalow in a huge estate, and that person derives their income on unearned income, from investments, which are not taxed. There's no dividend tax, there's no capital gains tax, there's no estate duty. So essentially, they are free riders, to use a phrase that, that has been used in Singapore politics, and they're enjoying the safety and security from the SPF and the SAF, while really paying a very small amount towards this. So again, it's what Singaporeans are looking for is a fair deal. You see, I think we are prepared to pay the taxes that we need to, as long as we can be assured, as Wendy said, that we can trust the government to provide us with opportunities for ourselves, for our children, for our parents. So I think that's number one. Number two is the complicated schemes. You know, there's a lot of piecemeal support that is being provided. Like, for example, you know, the enhanced assurance package, where you get $700 to $1,600 over 5 years. Somebody calculated that works out to about 38 cents to 87 cents a day. It's not even enough for a cup of kopi, you know. So all the other schemes are very complicated. They've got these GST vouchers, the USAVE vouchers, the CDC vouchers. And you know, you have to ask yourself, why do you make such a thing so complicated? And there are two potential theories. See, one theory is that they make it complicated partly because they don't trust the people. You know, Wendy talked about us trusting the government, but it's also got to be a two-way street. Yes. You know, and they always turn around and say, oh, so-and-so is going to scam the system. But the reality is the vast majority of Singaporeans are honest, hardworking people. I will not deny there's a handful of people who are going out to scam the system, but you punish the 95% just because of the 5%. So I think that's a big, exactly. It sounds more like an excuse. And I think the other reason is that they want you to feel grateful to them. You see, if you actually had a scheme where you cut the GST or you eliminated the GST on rice and sugar and essentials, it would be a huge savings. But they wouldn't be able to take credit for it. They wouldn't be able to give you, you know, a voucher at some CC or some event like that. Right. So I think you know, fundamentally, this I like the fact that trust was brought up, but trust is a two-way street. Yes. And I think the government has to trust the people in order for the people to really trust the government. Right.
Yes. So
Wendy,
yes, Wendy.
No, I think the reports also brought some great points about taxing the wealth more. And I think there was some prior discussion already about how there was an LSE study to say that, you know, even if you increase the tax amongst the wealthy class, it doesn't necessarily result in a drop of investment locally. I think that's one of the key concerns about increasing wealth tax, right? Whether that takes away Singapore's competitiveness. But I think studies have been cited to show that that's not necessarily the case. And in a recent media interview, I've shared as well that in Singapore's case, where we are looking at increasing the tax for high income earners of $500,000 and above. But at the same time, I think we can look at really managing corporate taxation in terms of taxing the dividends, which are declared by Singapore resident companies. And I think that's another area of wealth tax that we could be exploring. Because I think there's been prior conversations about trying to bring back the estate duty tax, and there's been some resistance around that front about how limiting it could be. But apart from these avenues, I think there could be a lot more creative avenues that we can look at taxing the wealthy class in Singapore. And I think that's important to reduce social inequality, which is an increasing problem in Singapore, the way I see it.
Yes, that is right. And although our finance minister declared that the budget intent is to support a fairer, more sustainable and inclusive society, the contents of the budget don't seem to bear that out. It does not support its declared intent. Definitely, I think personal income tax and for the higher brackets can actually be increased. I mean, if we are talking about progressivity, you created 2 tiers and you're giving them only 1% difference. I mean, to me, it's really a token. Why do it? Why go all the way and just why not increase 2%? A person earning $1 million under the government's proposal, he'll be paying up close to $200,000. Put it to 2%, another additional 1%, he will be paid additional $5,000 for his year of assessment. But what it looks like is that, yes, we are saying if you are hitting the 500,000 bracket, you can afford to pay more. You can afford to support the society even more for all the common good. And that is something we could actually do. After all, increasing the higher tax bracket by just an additional 1-2% only affects about 1% of taxpayers that are personal income taxpayers as at today. Bearing in mind that about half the workforce doesn't pay income tax. So when the government say about 1% of taxpayers will be impacted by this, we are talking about 0.5% of the workforce will be somehow impacted by this. So what I think we need to do is to show real progressivity, to reinforce the social compact, where indeed the more the people with more ability to contribute to help the society at large for the common good. But what does it mean if we were to push up the top bracket by another 1-2%, which affect only a small proportion of people? And we're talking about additional 10,000 or 20,000. We are still looking at about 26%. And what does 26% means? We always measure ourselves with Switzerland. Switzerland is hitting 40%. We are afraid of China and India, where all this wealth may be coming in from. Well, China is levying 40%, India 43%. Around us, Indonesia, Malaysia, they are going at 30%. What is 26%? If these people were to leave Singapore because of this higher tax bracket, then I say there is no loyalty, no commitment to the Singaporean society. These fleet-footed monies will leave anytime, anyway. Singapore is meaningless to them, and they will not defend Singapore. So why would one build, strengthen, and protect Singapore? I believe it is because they could identify and share values, family, relationships, and connections, national pride, and not because there's asset accumulation, there is property location, or money generative ability in a particular country. Our corporate tax is among the lowest, 17%, is the lowest since 2010. We were as high as 26% in 98. Can we increase by another 1, 2, or even 3%? Why not? Yes, Singapore has signed up for BEPS 2.0. That will bring up our corporate tax a little bit more. But if businesses appreciate what Singapore's unique strengths are, its geo position, its transportation and logistic hubs, its strong financial centers, its smart workforce, its rule of laws, paying the extra 2-3% is fair. It's fair and equitable. Don't make citizens pay for this benefit for the foreign businesses. I mean, let's all parties play their part. And increasing it to another 2-3% will not put Singapore very, very far. Because if again you want to compare China, India, they are going at 30%, 25-30, Indonesia, Malaysia, 24%. So by increasing another 2-3%, we are not even touching 20%. There is definitely room to explore. Finance Minister articulated something that the SDP has been pushing for, and that's wealth taxes, where the concept of wealth tax is to recirculate part of the wealth into the economy. And therefore, it mitigates social inequalities and strengthens that social compact. That is something we have been advocating for, and the Finance Minister acknowledges that. However, the tool that he uses is via the property tax. What the present budget says is that for non-owner occupied residential properties, he'll hit it with an 80% hike in property tax. And if you occupy your property and whose annual value is more than 30,000, that will be 100% hike, 2 times what you are paying for today. Now he says that, oh, don't worry, only 7% of owner-occupied properties will be impacted. Now, what is 7%? 85% of Singaporeans stays in a HDB property. So that leaves 15%. And out of this 15%, half of the non-HDB properties will be hit with a double increase in property tax whilst you are still staying in the same house. If you're owner-occupied, you are staying in that house, and you may be retired, and you may not have an active income. What do? Will you be forced to downgrade after all these years of hard work and smart and wise investment decisions that you made earlier? And if you have property that you let out to rent out as an investment, well, you may be relying on them for a major part of your income in your retirement years. So why especially punish these property owning business and income stream? I mean, after all, they're already paying their personal income tax, their corporate income tax, depending how they structure their investment properties with their rental income. The PAP's obsession of taking land away from private hands must stop. Already 85% of citizens' main assets are already in the hands of the government through their HDB flats. So why still need to punish and penalize those that is not within their grip? It is heartless, and we should stop this envy tax approach. Instead, I would advocate, do consider capital gain tax or even estate duties, where the payment of tax is at the point of transfer. And that will help with cash flow and still achieve the purpose of a wealth tax. That is something I think is really heartless and unnecessary. The other thing that I'm not happy with and I disagree with is the progressive wage model. The progressive wage model dictates and manages occupation, job scopes in the various sectors. Now, every business and company structures and organizes themselves differently from each other. You can multitask or be a multi-station crew member, or you could be a dedicated cleaner, a cook, or an operator. You can be a technician for a simple machinery or machinery of varying complexities. You can be a secretary, administrator, clerical officer, receptionist, and your job scopes may be different, your responsibilities may be different. There are evolving changes and response to market, let alone even in the same industry. What I'd advocate for is for less government micromanagement. Let market forces develop. What we advocate is just set a minimum wage for the country, one that is appropriate for living in Singapore. Then let market shape the needs and the requirements. Now, many countries have minimum wage. We are one of the few that do not. And instead, we put on a clunky bureaucratic structure that allows the government to control and dictate every part of the market, industry, and our lives in Singapore. I say, let the people go and be free.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think, this is just exactly the whole point. This micromanagement of the progressive wage model just only complicates matters and it feeds a bureaucracy.
Yes.
So, Singapore is the ultimate bureaucratic state. We used to make jokes about the bureaucracy in other Asian countries, but I think the bureaucracy has just grown and grown and grown, and soon it becomes an end to itself. And that is a concern.
So what then would we like to see in a budget 22? Yeah. Wendy, do you have some wish list?
Well, I think for myself, like I mentioned earlier, a lot more support schemes for the smaller SMEs. I think that's one area that government really needs to give a lot more recognition to, the kind of support that might be needed. And I think some of the initiatives and thinking is really in the right direction in terms of training mentorship. But I think a lot of that support can be targeted towards the smaller SMEs. Where, oftentimes the bosses and the managers could be multitasking the different roles. And when it comes to training of staff and the cost of that, I think a lot of the SMEs can actually gather more support when it comes to bring on board the relevant expertise and growth for Singaporean targeted workforce. So that's number one in terms of growing local productivity and innovation. I think that also ties in with your earlier conversation, because I think in the drive to having this need to maintaining a cheap workforce, That's largely skewed because we do not know where is the direction of our growth and where we can market Singaporeans as having these niche skill sets or niche job scopes where they can value add and contribute. So it's no longer about having a young graduate being there and available for a job and earning no more than $2,000, but having specific skill sets that MNCs and companies are going to be prepared to pay them higher wages and realistic growth wages that can actually allow them to gain a meaningful sense of livelihood in Singapore that's more sustainable over the long term. And I think that's a sense, I think, amongst the younger Singaporeans nowadays that it's very much driven towards a survival mode, that you are there to make sure that you're getting the jobs because you are in some sense competitive enough in terms of pricing, but you're not really being trained and skilled in the right way to make sure that you are seen as a valuable proposition to your company for the long term. And I think that's dangerous when we start looking at wages only from the price point of companies instead of realizing the growth potential of Singaporeans. And I think that ties in my earlier point as to having a very realistic sense of where we really want to grow our economy, the kind of sectors that we want to grow our economy in, the number of jobs, if we can get down to that level of data where we want to have specific trainings for. And I think then that's when you can translate that to a working budget where those policies will realize itself in the next 3 to 5 years when your young Singaporeans are graduating and they can see the benefits of where this entire budget discussion is leading to. So I would like to see a more realizable plan in that bigger sense, especially for smaller SMEs, especially for younger Singaporeans. I think the second aspect would be a lot more care support. Like I mentioned, you know, a lot of Singaporeans, friends, families I know in particular, have to devote a fair amount of time caring for their young children, disabled family members, and also for elderly parents, especially with smaller nuclear size nowadays in Singapore. And a lot of them have to give up either most of the job or part of the job to enable themselves to provide that level of care. So I think that's going to be a long-term problem because for a long time, I think Singaporeans are dependent on their CPF and the savings over time. Back in a generation where they're still able to accumulate that level of savings because HDB pricing for most of Singaporeans was once affordable. But if you look at the rising HDB prices where it's now crossing to the $1 million threshold nowadays, that's increasingly a big worry from a large number of Singaporeans where housing pricing is going to lead to and whether they can really translate that to a valuable savings plan for themselves in their old age. So especially for Singaporeans who are not in a position where they can accumulate their own savings, whether it's through personal savings, through employment, through CPF, through HDB, then I would actually like to see a lot more realistic support that can be given to Singaporeans who might be caught up in some level of care. And I think for PSP Women's Way, one of the programs we have been looking towards is really how we can build up that secondary economy that's sometimes talked about now in mainstream media as well, which are the home-based businesses. So women that we've seen, Singaporeans that we've seen, especially during the COVID period, they have some of them gone into home-based businesses to try and manage that level of income, revenue for themselves. Most of them that we've spoken to is because they are involved in some level of caregiving that doesn't enable to go out, doesn't allow them to go out and take up full-time job or even sometimes part-time jobs because of the irregular hours in their commitment. So again, as this sector grows, I also feel that a lot more support can be given to them in terms of having more flexible criteria in assessing whether they qualify for some kind of income support, whether it's in terms of resource training, support training, that can allow them to be a lot more independent. I like what Dr. Paul has shared in earlier conversations, which is that Singaporeans are really not looking for handouts, especially complicated handouts, where you are making it really difficult, I think, for them to go through quarterly assessments or half-yearly assessments where they have to resubmit documentation on themselves, their families. All of these are highly personal details as well. but they have to keep sharing and resharing. And sometimes it's so humiliating that we know there are low-income residents who have more or less given up on the system, right? And that's systemically replicated through a lot of the schemes that are often available on paper, but people are not assessing it at the right time and in the right sort of sectors because they just find it so difficult. And I think I really think that a lot more support can be given to enhance the social compact that Alfred was talking about, right? To make this a more sustainable, progressive, and equal society that we are all hoping to see for our fellow Singaporeans.
Thank you. Thanks, Wendy. Paul.
Yeah, very good points. And I'd like to take you up on one of them. You talked about caregiving, and it's been recognized all over the world that caregiving is disproportionately falling on the shoulders of women. And so, one of the things in Singapore is that we have this mandatory severe disability insurance called Care Shield. And women are expected to pay more in premiums and the rationale given by the government is that women live longer. But if you turn it around, actually rich Singaporeans live 5 years longer than poorer Singaporeans. The minister, the previous minister, Gan Kim Yong, said that in an answer to Leon Pereira, where he pointed out that for a variety of reasons, and again, this is seen in many parts of the world, but you don't see poorer Singaporeans being given a discount in their premiums or in their GST and things like that. So I think these things are just used where it's convenient.
Yes.
And unfortunately, like in many other parts of the world, women end up getting the short end of the stick. So, my big wish list when it comes to the budget is obviously in healthcare. We were told that this budget, that there was a need to raise taxes and to cut expenditure because of rising healthcare costs. And this argument goes around that people are living longer. Actually, I haven't seen a lot of 120-year-olds or 130-year-olds wandering around the streets or in the hospitals. So it's not that people are living longer, but it's that more people are not dying young. And it's a democratization of longevity. In the past, rich people always used to live long. The kings used to live to, Queen Victoria lived to like 90 over years of age. So rich people live very long. But what's happening now is that poor people are surviving. There's better medical care, so they're surviving the illnesses of childhood. They're not dying from accidents at the age of 20 or 30, and they're not dying from heart attacks at the age of 40 or 50 because, my friends, the cardiologists, are doing such a good job of keeping them alive. So what happens is they reach 60 or 70, and unfortunately, if they do not have good primary care when they're 30 or 40, then they end up with all the complications. They end up with diabetes, they end up with cancer, and with a lot of other conditions which really cost a lot in terms of healthcare. So the government solution is, number one, to raise revenue by raising GST and small amounts from the income tax, as you pointed out, a 1 or 2% rise in income tax and stuff like that. And the second part of the government solution is this idea of capitation. Now, capitation is not a new idea. Capitation is an idea which was going around in Europe and North America 20, 30 years ago. And in fact, I did a Google search and capitation was, and I remembered that capitation was put in place in Singapore at the beginning of the 20th century. But it failed. And they sort of gave up on it. And to explain what capitation is, basically paying for healthcare, there's different ways you can pay for healthcare. Ultimately, most of us pay for healthcare through some form of insurance. And insurance is a form of risk pooling. It's like with car insurance. They estimate your risk. You drive a red car, you pay higher insurance for some reason. This is what it is like in the States. Or in Singapore, you get a no-claim discount. If you're a safe driver, you haven't got into an accident for years and years and years, you get a no-claim discount and your insurance goes down. If you drive a sports car, obviously your insurance is higher. So similarly, the insurance companies do their calculations. They decide how much you have to pay. You pay insurance. And in fact, one of my friends told me insurance is like taking a bet with the insurance company. He was referring to life insurance. And he said it's a great bet because the insurance company is betting that you will die before the age of 75. if you die before the age of 75, you win the bet, you collect the money, but you're dead. It says if you live over 75, you win also because you're still alive. So even if you lose the money, so in a way, that's how insurance should be. It should be kind of a win-win that you put in the money in. If you need it, it's there. If you don't need it, you're happy. You're not sick. In that sense. So that's insurance. The other way that healthcare is paid for is this fee for service. That means you need something, you're going to see the doctor charges what he feels like. And that is essentially gone out of the window in most parts of the world. Okay, it's only available in very, very elite sort of sectors. The other way is that the government pays for everything. That is also going out of the picture because most governments realize they cannot afford to pay for healthcare. So enter capitation. Now, capitation is a system where the government decides, okay, look, we're going to pay $1,000 to this doctor to take care of 100 people. And the assumption is it will cost an average of $10 to take care of this 100 people for 1 year. So if these 100 people don't see the doctor at all, the doctor pockets $1,000 for doing nothing. If, on the other hand, one of those people needs a bypass operation, then the doctor has to cop up the extra $25,000. I mean, he's not common one who's going to get $8,000 bypass, but most of the people would have to pay about $25,000 for a bypass. So there's a powerful incentive. In theory, there's a powerful incentive for the doctor to go into preventive healthcare, to try and prevent these people from needing a bypass. So in theory, it's a great idea. You fix the amount, you put the responsibility not at a bureaucrat, but at a doctor, a healthcare system, to try and keep costs down by keeping people healthy. But in reality, it just doesn't work. And because doctors are human, the healthcare systems are human, and the reality is you end up under-servicing people. And in fact, as I was looking up the data on the earlier attempts at capitation in Singapore, in 2006 at the Singapore's National Medical Convention, the PERMSEC at the time, Ms. Yong Ying Yi, when she was introducing the plan for capitation, she mentioned that an overzealous implementation of capitation ends up with under-servicing. So people don't get the care that they need because the provider is constrained by the budget that's provided. If the guy is paid $1,000 and he's expected to spend $25,000 on a bypass, he's going to go bankrupt in no time. So they introduced the Chronic Disease Management Program, which was the first version of capitation that was introduced in Singapore, and it just couldn't work. There were transaction costs, there was too much bureaucracy, and ultimately it was replaced, interestingly enough, by the Pioneer Generation Package and CHAS, which do work. I've been with elderly relatives to facilities, private facilities where you have access to Pioneer Generation and CHAS, and the amount of paperwork is relatively minimal. So it can be done. It's not that this government doesn't know how to do healthcare. But to move into capitation where you fix the cost, I think is a step backwards. And so my wish list would be that they actually they switch instead to a universal health insurance system where there's a controlled insurance. It's affordable for everybody. There's a fixed premium that everybody pays. If you can't afford to pay it, there's subsidies. If you want the hotel services like an Orchard Road hospital, you pay extra. You pay extra. You pay for your own private insurance. And I think it would work. You could get rid of the bureaucracy that we have with the 3Ms, with the CHAS, with the Elder Shield, the Care Shield, and all the other complicated systems that we have. And we just have a single, simple health insurance policy. This is known as the SDP Healthcare Plan of 2012, revised in 2019.
Updated edition.
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe just to add a little bit to that conversation about healthcare, it's interesting as well. I think in the last G, we had a brief conversation about how to support the growth in healthcare costs, right? And I think one sector which I know Singapore has been doing some work in is on medical tourism. But I think largely that's because a number of the neighboring countries around us has been rather limiting in their medical care facilities over time, But moving forward, I think as a lot of these economies are also growing their wealth, the middle and the upper income, there's probably going to be a lot more emphasis on preventive healthcare, holistic healthcare. And again, if we can step out our healthcare system, our medical tourism to really reach out to these growing income classes in the neighboring countries, and develop an economy around that. That could probably provide some avenue for cross-subsidization of healthcare cost. So it doesn't necessarily have to be one-dimensional in terms of looking at cost and finding taxation as a means of providing that revenue to provide for long-term quality healthcare for Singaporeans. I think we can have more creative systems as well as creative economic building structures to see how we can better support that.
Yeah, I would have a small word of caution in that, Malaysia and Thailand have very effective medical tourism sectors. And it's really, really hard to compete. I know Singaporeans who used to go to, before COVID, they used to go to Thailand for their LASIK and they get pretty good services. And what they get is actually the hotel services. The CEO of the Bumrunghad Hospital once gave an interview to Business Times. And he said, ultimately, he says, what you need is, you don't need high-tech services. You need competent doctors. And then you leverage on the advantages that you have. And he said, what advantage does Thailand have? He said, it's hospitality. So if somebody wants his gallbladder taken out, we send a limousine to the airport, pick them up, we take out their gallbladder safely, competently, and then we take them to Phuket for a resort and recuperation. And it's very hard to compete with that, honestly.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, my wish list.
Yes.
Well, this one, I'm not sure will it ever happen, but I was hoping that one day our government or the government of the day can look into restructuring our CPF and just let CPF be focused on retirement needs. Instead of, and remove the housing component. When you remove the housing component, there'll be less contribution from your monthly income. There'll be less deduction from your salaries each month to contribute towards it, because you cannot use it for your housing needs. So you keep CPF just for retirement purpose. And that is basically what we want to be ready for when we finish our productive years in society. Well, also now then we got to figure out how then do we help our people to purchase their homes. Well, we can always look at housing saving plans, privatize it, don't let the government run it. We have enough strong banks, fund houses, mutual funds, insurance companies that's able to offer such housing plans. Oh, building societies too. And by removing it from the CPF, I hope that this will help make our public housing a lot more affordable. It will influence buying behavior of consumers. I just don't know why the government should not be complicit in stoking up public housing prices with the bulk of the properties that is under HDB. They should be able to set future sustainable housing policy instead of having these runaway prices where our young finds difficulty in buying their house, the roof under their flat, under themselves, over their heads. So with 85% of Singapore's population staying in HDB, with HDB, the HDB has the ability to moderate and manage the real estate prices in Singapore. Well, we hope with this privatized housing savings that can be created, we'll be able to put more money into people's hands. The HDB will relook at their housing policy. Well, if you just look at old records, the day the PAP government allows our CPF to be used for public housing, our HDB price just shot up, right? So I think that's a bad mistake, and it's time to seriously look at a possible solution. Let the people decide for themselves. The other hope that I was wishing, and I'm not sure I can ever see it, is for our government to exercise prudent spending, to cut according to our cloth. I mean, you run your own household. If you bring in $2,000 a month, you wouldn't spend $3,000, right? If you have a business, and you have plans to run your business. If your income, your profits is 1,000, you will not spend more than 1,000. If you are thinking of expanding, you look at your projects and try to justify, is it viable? And therefore convince your shareholders or the banks to support you. Instead of a government stretching out its hand like a spoiled brat, demanding it be paid so that it can spend freely. I mean, I hear the MOE teachers and healthcare workers are really overworked. Are they really doing too much? Or is their primary focus lost? Is the MOE curriculum right for today's world? Or are we packing all in? Really, can our kids think better? Are they ready for tomorrow? Why are so many of our young going overseas for their further education? Probably, I think, that there may be just too many management and administrative staff and too few boots on the ground to do the primary work. We have 3 hospital clusters right now. I mean, with their own stacks of CEOs and their bureaucracies. I mean, we used to have 1 MOH running our hospitals, and now we have 3 big chunky clusters. Triplicated? Are we saying that the East, West, Central demographics are so different from each other that we need some specialization? We have so many political appointees in Singapore. We have 5 mayors just to coordinate PA's work at $660,000 a pop. Superfluous bureaucracy. We got to stop this multitude of political appointees. We have ministries with multiple ministers and political appointees. Just let the civil service do its work, not a civil service that is politically biased to the control of one party. The civil service is non-political, so there is no need for more political appointees, unless, of course, the ministers are not performing or they are not proficient in the first place. We need to have less public waste of funds. And we want to throw $900,000 into SPH.
900 million.
Million.
A million.
The billion. Yeah.
Million, 900 million.
Yes. Credibility is questioned when we see overwhelmingly PAP happy news and hardly see any positive non-PAP news. Is this reflective of Singapore society and the people? Or is that what the government wants the people to perceive? Now, society is made up of varying opinions, viewpoints, preferences. So how public funds are used to cater to the different needs of the different segments? If SPH is indeed news for the people of Singapore, then it must cater to all needs and demands of all Singaporeans, all segments of it. Now, unless we are saying that Singapore is a broken democracy, where non-PAP citizens are always not newsworthy, where only non-PAP citizens has no opinion that is worthy of contribution to society, and only PAP-aligned people and opinion has a monopoly of ideas and opinions. The government must ask SPH to account for its mandate of providing unbiased news of Singapore society for all Singaporeans, notwithstanding their political thinking, affiliation, religion, or race. After all, public funds have been utilized. Otherwise, it is just news for the 61% of Singaporeans. So if SPH is truly an important for all Singaporeans media institution, I think we can also consider putting a more Singapore representative board and maybe editorial board so that various stakeholders are represented and involved. Vanity projects. Oh, we have Memorial Park. We are still talking about it, even for a country with such a short history like Singapore. We have NS Square. I mean, I thought we have a huge stadium just down the road from where the floating platform is. We have numerous huge parade grounds both in the armed forces and the home team. And we still need to build another big NS square in the middle of the city. Oh, we wanted more business parks and centers in Changi, Punggol, Woodlands, Jurong Lake. Just go to the CBD today, go to visit Tuas, go to Changi. You'll see lots of empty plots of land today, unfilled spaces with no tenants, no business, no investments. And we still want to build these grand business parks. Now, the public is not convinced of Terminal 5 after the failure of Terminal 4 and a T3 experience that shows that it's not yet fully utilized. How much good has Jewel brought to Singapore? Stop wasting money. Stop saying that there is a need to raise more funds, more revenues, just to squander on vanity. That's my wish list. I'm not sure will I ever get to see it with this present government.
That's pretty hard hitting. But I agree with you on the SPH issue. And I think as Wendy pointed out, Manwai asked some very important questions in Parliament because it seems very odd that the profits of SPH are all going to be taken over by a private company, whereas the liabilities and all the other stuff is being transferred to a not-profit, which is going to be funded by taxpayers, by you and me. Yeah, that seems really odd. Wendy?
Yeah, I think that's the crux of it. I think I like idea mooted by Alfred to say that, you could look at the more independent editorial, and I think that would be a welcome step. But I think that's a first given already as an editorial that you should be looking at news that caters to the needs of Singaporeans across the spectrum and not only those who support a particular narrative. But what is more important about that spending is that it shouldn't be subsidized by the public, regardless of the kind of editorial it's putting forward. And SPH as a group of entities, they themselves are profitable, especially with the property holding arm that's been invested over a number of years. And I think that's the key point that's raised to say that, you shouldn't isolate the profitable aspects from the non-money generating company and then have the public fund that. Because I think that would be highly inequitable because the profits are not being channeled for public benefit in that sense.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. So I think there's some questions from the Facebook Live. Maybe we could try and deal with those.
Yes. So we have a question that from the audience that says that with this uncertainty that is going around the world resulting from the Ukrainian conflict, transportation and fuel price and utilities prices will trend up. Supply chains may be impacted and prices will be going up. What can the government do about it? Especially there are a lot more enlightened governments around the world who I guess with their correct priorities has put in place assistance to their citizens. What do you think we could do?
Well, I think, a large proportion of the cost of fuel is actually in the taxes. So we're not talking about it, and taxes are good because we want to try and discourage fossil fuel utilization. But in the immediate short term, when we're facing a global crisis like this, I think it is reasonable to do some degree of suspension of taxes or temporary reduction in the taxes. And the other thing is that, in Singapore, it seems to be a coincidence that every time one oil company petrol company raises the prices, everybody else raises the prices on the same day.
Wow. I guess Singapore is very small, yeah?
Yeah, that's what they always say. But, as you were talking about the free market, it doesn't seem to exist. In the petrol stations along the road where I go along, everybody's got the same price. Yes. It's just so bizarre. Wendy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think in terms of short-term remedies, it's just that we are looking a lot more at infrastructural support. And I think right now there's actually an oversupply realistically. And I agree with Paul to say that a lot of that is actually artificialized through tax. So I think the government can look at some immediate subsidies and remedies through that to try and moderate cost. And hopefully this crisis will be a short-term one that will not result in any long-term inflationary pricing.
Yes. I mean, with such a short, well, we are not sure, but looking at it, it may be a short shock. It's something that the country as a whole can come together and support each other, and the government could actually lead that by possibly reducing the taxes that they put onto it. I mean, it's just a short period of time. I'm sure it's a responsive government should easily be able to step up. I have another question from the audience, and it's on medical insurance. He felt that it's very limiting, and whenever he wanted to use it.
Yeah, so I think, this is one of the concerns. In most national healthcare insurance, there's a cap on how much the individual has to pay. There is a co-payment, and there's a cap on the co-payment as well. In MediShield Life, there's a cap on how much the MediShield Life is willing to pay. It's not, it's the other way around. So in other words, if you, I'm sure you've heard, there were these stories of children who required very, very expensive medication. And they hit the cap on MediShield Life very, very quick. But if you were in a truly a universal health insurance system, there would be a cap on how much you have to pay, not on how much benefits you would get. And the way this works is through the concept of reinsurance. Now, reinsurance is something that many businesses are familiar with, and that's how essentially insurance companies stay alive. Is that they insure the insurance, so that nobody wants to get hit with a huge insurance bill that you just cannot pay, and then the whole system will collapse. So reinsurance is a way in which insurance companies protect themselves from diversify, and they protect themselves from these massive insurance claims. So that's the first thing, is that the caps need to go, and the caps need to be reversed. They need to be the other way around. See, they need to be a cap on how much an individual has to pay, not on how much the mandatory insurance is going to cover your medical illnesses if a doctor feels that you need this treatment, or if something that's going to save your life in the case of these children.
So this is very unique.
Yes, it is. It is uniquely Singaporean. It's very unfortunate.
And that's because our uniquely Singapore can dictate.
They can get away with it, which is what I felt. The second thing is this idea of premiums. Now, again, with national health insurance, the idea is that the young will cross-subsidize the old. But here we have a system where the old pay more, so it's kind of inverted the thing. In fact, there's a lady who is the head of the one of the insurance associations, and she gave a very good comment. See, and she said that the whole purpose of insurance is risk pooling. See, everybody puts in kind of the same amount, assuming you're at the same level of risk, and then you obviously claim when you need to, and if you don't need to, you're happy you don't need to claim. But she says that if the cost of claims are going up, instead of penalizing the few individuals who tend to claim more, you still need to continue with the same principle of spreading the risk. Everybody has to pay a little bit more, and then you've got to go and address the underlying problem. Is it because of profiteering by pharmaceutical companies? Is it because of the lack of group purchasing options that are done, or whatever reason that there is? It needs to be addressed holistically. So I think that's an important consideration that has not been taken into account.
I guess doesn't sound very market responsive. It's a lot more one-sided.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Wendy, anything to add?
Yeah, I definitely agree on simplifying the bureaucracy and having a more realistic sense of the kind of medical care and support we can provide as families. So just taking an example, I think last year my mother-in-law had to be admitted to hospital for a particular surgery to a kneecap. And we are staying in the same household, and I would have thought that as a daughter-in-law, I could use my CPF and MediSave to contribute to a surgery. But somehow I'm told that I'm not immediate family. So which I would find surprising, because that's not the reality, right? I mean, we are staying together as family, and I would really like to support her, but there's a lot of red tape and considerations and criteria, and I think a lot of Singaporeans will find it frustrating as well. Because while some of us would want to contribute to a household, but then there's a lot more artificial criteria that are set in place, which I think there can be a lot more flexibility, especially if we are talking about aging population and providing care and support.
Well, Wendy, there's another question here from the our audience, and I think this one should be quite familiar to you. What do you think about higher contribution from our returns from the reserves that we have?
The NIRC?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think there's been a bit of discussion around that point about the conversation leading up to the increase of GST, right? And whether we could be using more of our NIRC. And I think the current estimate is about 19 billion from the last fiscal year in 2021. So the first immediate question, again, relating back to my earlier presentation about how I think there should be a lot more perspective of our past and our present, which is our current reserves and NRC, and whether we can be utilizing more of those immediate resources instead of increasing the burden on the average Singaporean, especially the lower income Singaporeans and the middle income Singaporeans as well, by increasing our GST, although in a staged process over the next 2 years. But realistically, if we look at our immediate resource, that I think already provides a ready and sustainable revenue. And what we're trying to raise is only about 3.5 billion over the 2 years. So if we can have immediate resources of 19 billion, it's a little bit artificial to try and increase the pressure, especially in our earlier conversation. We're already looking at inflation with food, with transport, with fuel, utilities, and these cuts across all Singaporean households, right, in terms of spending. So rather than to further artificialize that inflationary pressure, there's definitely a lot more conversation that we can have in looking at spending our current reserves. So it's a bit like you have, $19,000 savings in your bank account, but somehow you're forcing everyone in your family to contribute to a separate kitty just so that you can use that separate kitty for future spending when you already have that $19,000. And by having people take out from their current spending, that's going to impact the economy in a particular way as well, because we are still recovering from the COVID pressures, the affected businesses. When we are looking at household spendings that's going to be increased artificially through rises in GST spending, people are going to be a lot more cautious in how they are going to spend, whether it's through F&B spending, and having the access, when they take their children out and all that. So that's all going to factor in household spending and considerations. So I would have thought that the correct approach is to see how we can relieve some of the inflation so that Singaporean households are more prepared to spend and thereby contribute to the economy in process of recovery, as opposed to adding on to that inflationary pressure where people actually become a lot more conservative.
That's right. That's right. I'm totally aligned with you on that one. After all, the NIRC returns is already annualized over such a long period of time that will already address certain volatilities in the market and investment returns. And with that, we could actually see that if the investment returns of other sovereign wealth funds to go by, certainly we can release a lot more of these returns back to the people, to the country. I mean, just example that one of our viewers have, CPF return rates. It is a small 2.5%. Our returns are a lot more than that, but we prefer to return just 2.5% and then plow the rest back. I mean, look, this is returning what is decent as a human being. All right. Why do you want to deprive such return? I mean, let them build up their nest egg. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, I don't. That's one of the things that we could look at, improving our giving back more to our people.
Actually, let me interject here. I think, Wendy's point, which Manwai has been making in Parliament quite a lot, is, I think, being misframed by many in the commentariat. Because essentially what he's talking about is not touching the reserves, but the returns on the reserves.
Yes.
So in fact, the analogy is not so much that you've got 19,000 in the bank, but you have an endowment policy which matured and you got 19,000 bonus. And instead of spending that 19,000 bonus, you say, okay, I'm only limited to spend 9,000 of that bonus. The other 9,000 I must keep somewhere else. And then my children, you know, I've got to, they need some books for school, and I'm going to say, no, you cannot, or you know, you cannot go for this class or something like that. So why are they doing that? Because I've got a rule which says I must keep that 9,000 of that bonus in the bank, and I can only spend 9,000 of that bonus on you.
And not only do they keep half of it back, you know, and reinvest. Every year, Singapore is selling land.
Right.
All right. And this land sales, the land proceeds are also going back to the investment pool. So the investment pool is growing. We're not saying that it's not growing at all.
Exactly. And in fact, I like what Hazel did. She pointed out that, you know, the land is sold for 30 years. It's sold for 50 years. And after that, it comes back to the government.
Yeah.
So she says that you could divide up the proceeds depending on how long the lease is. Isn't that right, Wendy?
Yeah, correct. So I think she did share an example of that.
Yeah.
To suggest that that could be a more sustainable source of revenue to look at as well.
Sure.
From land sales.
Anyway, I was just reminded that we talk about the CPF returns. Right now, I think generally it's 2.5%, but there are higher returns of 3.5%, 4.5%, depending on the different
retirement account.
Yeah, different accounts. So, but still, there's a lot more that can be done for the people. Okay, time catching up. I think let's move on to the last point about our views of the GST increase. What do you think of that, Wendy?
So like I mentioned, I think the timing of it is actually could be better reconsidered. I don't think this is actually the right timing and the opportunity to increase GST, even if there's a need to do so. But of course, the first step is really looking at our past accounting. I think Alfred has given a very detailed account as to where the different aspects could be cut back, whether it's on showcase projects, whether it's on excessive bureaucracy, the different types of roles that has been played out in civil sectors, like the different mayors that we have, where we think that a lot of these excess can be moderated. And that could already be one immediate source of revenue that we could be looking at without really going into a GST tax, which is largely regressionary, right? Because when we look at income spending, like I mentioned earlier, the brunt of it will be felt by the lower income households. And I think it's not just the next 2 years, but it's going to be for the lifelong until the next revised GST, which I imagine that you can only go up in the long run, right? I don't think there's ever a point they're going to consider bringing it back down where the economy goes through another cycle. And I think that's part of the problem when we talk about increases, even for utilities, you know, it's always talking about increasing when there's a change in economic structure of fuel and consumption, but we are never looking at revising it down when the economy is hard hit. And I think when you're looking at the timing of a GST, I think that's one important consideration when you actually introduce it. And then moving forward, how that is realistically going to impact the economy, especially when we're looking at a recovering economy where full employment has not been reached, where there's immediate crisis such as the Ukrainian crisis. And given all that uncertainty, by increasing that particular measure right now, how that's overall going to affect household spending. And I think the kind of ad hoc, you know, schemes in terms of rebates to lower income households, while that has some immediate transitionary relief, that doesn't really provide the long-term measure and immediate support after that 2 years, right? When they are looking to pay the additional 2% for every single item that they're basically spending moving forward, right? I know there's been some discussion about looking at a tiered system for GST. At capping, for example, groceries where it concerns basic needs such as household diapers, medical, pharmaceutical supplies. And again, I think some of the feedback is that it's going to be expensive to administratively handle a tiered system. But then again, there are many economies who have done it, right? And there are positive examples we can look towards. If you're going into a granular distinction as to, oh, it'll be unfair to cap the taxes on more expensive items within that classification. So for example, rice, you could have organic brown rice, which is a little more premium. But I think, it's not about looking granular details to then decide that a large majority who basically just eat white rice, and that forms a large part of our day-to-day food, right? And just taking a very realistic perspective of household spending instead of nitpicking on details to sort of discount what could be realistic working propositions. The other consideration could be like looking at CHAS, right? Where a lot of Singaporeans have already been assessed based on their income on their category. And I think those are existing schemes where we can tap on to decide, for example, if the low income CHAS card holders can be given pure exemption from GST increase, right? And this could be simpler schemes that we could be exploring, where it comes to having a more sustainable and more equitable administration of a GST scheme, even if we are going to have one, which I think is probably a bit out of discussion, that we will have that GST increase. But so then the next working step moving forward is how do we manage that system such that we do not exacerbate the social inequalities that we're currently seeing in Singapore.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. I guess there's a will, there'll be a way. Well, if we are able to exempt healthcare spending, we can exempt things today. Why can't we exempt or zero rate even more things? It's just the will to do it. And what I see from the present budget is that there's a will to increase the GST rather than a will to find ways to help the population with such inflationary results. Yes, I feel that the timing is really, really bad, with the economy still shaky, future still uncertain, and it will cause unnecessary hardship. And so just one word from me. It's just pure heartless. It's not fully justified. Expenses can be curtailed, as we discussed, especially in such uncertain times. And our MOF has actually shown that. We have a 10 billion resilience package drawn up, where we attempted to draw $10 billion, and we are able to find 5 billion somewhere else through curtailment, through reallocation. Just about reprioritizing, and it can be done. It's whether you have the will to do it. And my final point on the GST view is to increase in 2 steps is just so unnecessary. It's an unnecessary burden and cost to businesses and organizations. You got to do it 2 times. You got to change things 2 times. I mean, is there a need? Just keep. If you are insistent on keeping 1%. On increasing, just keep the 1% and let's be happy with it for the next few years. This is very bad time to increase.
So I'm going to answer very quickly 2 of the questions which popped up on the chat. First one on the question of our size of our reserves. And it really puzzles me why almost every other country in the world is able to talk about the size of the reserves, but we can't. And I still haven't heard a satisfactory answer. Countries which are much more vulnerable in terms of speculation on their currency and things. And our currency is maintained against a basket of currencies by MAS very tightly and efficiently. So that is a big question which has not been answered. The second question about HDB leases, and this is a question I actually posed to the CEO of HDB when she gave a talk at the IPS, and I said, surely there's a way to give strata title to HDB flat owners. If you're truly a flat owner, then you should be able to have strata title. But HDB flat owners do not have strata title, unlike people who own condos. So there's a big difference. If all the residents of an HDB block decided to unblock the thing, they don't have strata title. They can't do it. You see. That's right. So because they don't own it. So you're caught in between. You pay property tax, but you don't have strata title. And again, she chose not to answer that question. Now, when it comes to GST, I hear what both of you are saying, but in reality, from what we've seen from all the countries in the world, the only way to bring GST down or to get rid of it is to change the government. and I think that's part of the reason why both of us, or 3 of us, are all involved in politics. People always say, can't you change things from within, or can't you speak up? And I think over the years, I've tried. Many of us have tried. We've tried to change within. We've gone to feedback sessions. We've been involved in various civil society. We've written letters to the newspaper. And then sooner or later, you realize the only way to actually make a change is to come forward. And I'm really impressed by young people that we've had coming forward, putting their names up, not being afraid of being marked, and coming forward and standing up and being counted. And frankly, that's the only way to change the GST.
Well, we are coming close to 9:30, and we got to wrap it up. So is that your
That's
closing
my
remarks?
final point.
That's
Yes.
a closing remark. Wendy, any closing remarks from you?
So during election, I always find it interesting, right? That, whether you're from the incumbent, whether you're from the opposition, or alternative parties, there's a lot of common ground in terms of growing a compassionate Singapore, right? A state that cares more for its people. I don't think we disagree on that common ground that we want to see a more compassionate and equitable Singapore. But then, like I said, when you come back to looking at the actual policies that translate, and especially the results from the last GE, right? How do you then send that messaging out to Singaporeans? And I think raising GST is definitely not the way forward. So looking at building social compact, the trust both ways between the Singaporeans and government, and also having a lot less bureaucracy in that distrust from the state of its people. I think that's where I'd like to see a lot more growth in the next few years.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. Well, having lived through the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years, and after 60 years of PAP-led governance of our Singapore society, I think Singaporeans now need to re-examine what living in this society means to them, to their family and their loved ones, and to their neighbors. Innately, as humans, we want to be gracious and caring. We want to be useful and meaningful to one another. We lament of the missing kampong spirit. We yearn and appreciate the gotong royong. We may strive for excellence and good, honest work. But amidst this daily pursuit of life, we want to be patient, respectful, gracious, and helpful to one another. Because we are human. We need the warmth of one another, because we are in it together. We are in it together as a community, as a society, and as a nation. Just ask those who are in their 60s or even later, in their twilight years, what is important to them. Now, what we have now is as a budget this year is a game strategy, a playbook, where in exchange for extracting more from its powerless citizens for the years to come, the government threw out bits of cash and food coupons to soften the cold and harsh and heartless reality. It should not be about maximizing what a government can extract from its citizens at the moment, but to see how it can responsibly spend for today, tax only what is truly needed, whilst building up the attractiveness of Singapore as a place where its citizens are proud to identify and call it home, and for the international and regional communities to invest and participate in, because of our ability to provide the best services in this part of the world. The Singapore budget must build up its people. It must build up its community and build up the nation. It must recognize today's situation, strengthen the people, and not weaken it. Well, we thank you for spending 90 minutes with us in our conversation about the 2020 budget. We thank Wendy Loh for joining us from
Thank you.
PSP.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And thanks, Paul, for joining us.
Thank you
together.
very much.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Wendy.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I thought it went well. Yeah.
Yeah, it went better than expected. So because I was fearful of the initial disruption. Sorry for that. I
Yeah.
think I
No,
got
no.
locked out.
Yeah, very briefly, I saw your face disappear, but it came back very quickly.
I was like, oh my God, I probably clicked on a wrong
Yeah.
button or something.
Yeah, no, it worked out well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the
Thank-
invite again.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll probably be sharing your video on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
inform our social media.
Good. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Wendy.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.